So which are the best elites choices for Codex Space Marines? Let's talk about my favourites and what I think makes them strong. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, the strategy focused 40k channel, where today we're talking about the elites of the Space Marines, an army that's already fairly elite by the standards of 40k at large. There really are a ton of choices within the Space Marine elite slot. It's one of the busiest in the entire codex. Lots of very competitive units here, and it's really not too uncommon to see things like battalions or Vanguard detachments, ones that allow you to get a serious amount of elites into one army. In the video we're going to talk through a few honourable mentions that maybe didn't get into my top choices, then go through my 6 favourite units in the elite slot for stronger Space Marine lists, their strengths and weaknesses, how I'd equip them, and what I think makes them strong. I'm not going to cover literally every single Space Marine elite's choice here, though I have done a bit of a breakdown of the strengths and weaknesses of every unit in the Space Marine Codex, which I will link down in the video description if you'd like to hear a little bit more about the rest, and talk through a few of my favourite picks. First up, before we get into my favourite 6 choices, I thought we'd just mention a few other honourable mentions. First up, the Apothecary is 75 or 80 points depending on whether you're playing him as a Primaris, and usually an extra 35 points on top of that, as most people tend to want to run him as the Chief Apothecary, then upgrade to the Selfless Healer Warlord trait. Over 100 points is quite a big investment into a unit that's not going to be doing all that much direct damage, but often over the course of the 5 turns he can easily pay for himself, freely resurrecting one slain Space Marine each turn, which could easily be something big, meaty and threatening, something like, say, an Eradicator, a Terminator, a Centurion or an Attack Bike. On top of that, he'll give the units nearby the 6+ Feel No Pain type save, so a bit more durable than normal, and also heals injured models that have taken a few wounds but not died. Overall, in general, he's going to be quite a nice buff to the durability of a Marine infantry-based army, and will maybe perhaps a bit stronger in early 9th edition when a lot of solid Space Marine lists were playing things like Salamanders and loads of Gravis armor. If he's got slow-moving units that he can keep up with and keep healing, I think he's usually going to be a pretty decent investment. But after GW raised the points cost of the Chief Apothecary upgrade, people don't seem to be taking him quite as much, maybe just a bit more of a niche choice. I will say though that the faster versions of the Apothecary, the Blood Angel's Sanguinary Priest or the Dark Angel's Ravenwing Apothecary, both of those do seem really quite solid. I still see a lot of play within competitive lists. The Priest is quite nice as he can be really quite threatening in his own right as well, plus put one unit into the powerful Blood Angel's Assault Doctrine each turn, and the Ravenwing one can zip around resurrecting valuable Ravenwing bikes or Deathwing Terminators. Being faster and tougher makes his buff get where it actually needs to be. Next up, another interesting pick is the Judiciar. Again, a slightly niche choice, but he does crop up in some powerful Space Marine melee lists from time to time. His damage for the points isn't too bad, but really the reason that you actually want to take one is for his Fight's Last ability with that Tempora Mortis ability within 3 inches, and paired with a solid Space Marine combat list, he can be quite good to sort of defend them from enemy charges. Say if you've got an elite squad of Bladeguard clustered around him, if the enemy charges him between Heroic Intervention, there's a good chance that he might be able to make them fight last, and make them very hard to charge without getting hit very hard first. In particular, Judiciars are really quite efficient with any faction that gets something like a 6-inch Heroic Intervention, so it's good with any Warlord traits or relics that give him that. The Space Wolves would be ideal, but they already have the Armour of Rus, which can have a very similar effect just for the cost of one relic rather than a whole character. I believe the Black Templar's Devout Push stratagem could be a really interesting choice for this guy, which could also extend the threat range of him laying down a Fight's Last. I think he's not always the most helpful. A lot of the time I think you might have been better off with something like a Captain, who can hit pretty hard and also buff your units nearby. In general, I do feel like you're paying a bit of a premium for that Fight's Last ability, but in some lists it could definitely be worth it. Finally, before we get into my top picks, Terminators I think can certainly be very solid, but just often seem to be left behind for other choices. You can get regular flavour, the Relic ones or the Assault Terminators. They all get a 2+ save, 3 wounds and 3 deep strike. I think they're solid enough all-rounders, but maybe just seem to be slightly outcompeted by Vanguard Veterans, at least in most armies. Of course, some chapters will absolutely love Terminators. Space Wolves Wolfguard are just incredibly flexible. Deathwatch can get some obsec ones and actually have a surprising amount of melee buffs for them. And Dark Angel's Deathwing are just very intimidating all round. Lots of solid options tailored for them, and most importantly they're only wounded on a 4+ thing, which makes them a real pain to shift. Terminators are absolutely definitely a top tier pick in the Dark Angels. With those out of the way, let's get into my favourite choices though. First up, I thought we'd start with the Bladeguard Veterans. who maybe not quite seeing quite as wide play as a few of the other choices, I think still are a really hard unit to go too far wrong with in the Space Marine Elites section. For the fairly cheap points cost of 105 points, they can get some seriously decent melee on the go with 13 attacks at strength 5, AP-3, damage 2, and perhaps more importantly than that, they're also incredibly tough for the points cost between their storm shields and transhuman physiology if they need it. Typically, if the enemy has to be shooting at any one unit out of the Space Marine army, Bladeguard Veterans are perhaps one of the units that are best suited to tanking damage. Perhaps their main weakness as a complete dedicated melee unit is that they're at least relatively slow. Not exactly the most helpful thing for reaching combat, but at least in 9th they shouldn't have too much difficulty in reaching midfield objectives and fighting over those, and they're also somewhat vulnerable to any of the many and varied -1 damage mechanics that are available in 9th edition. Whenever those swords are only doing a single pip of damage, they're going to feel a bit more underwhelming. Sorry, a bit of a typo on the slide there. Obviously they're not particularly vulnerable to damage 1 weapons. Really quite a lot of chapters can make good use of the Bladeguard as well. I'd say perhaps the single most impressive one might be White Scars. Advance and charge is absolutely excellent with their relatively slow movement. Fallback and charge is handy. The Doctrine making all those power swords damage 3 is really quite scary, and Kosara Khan pairs really nicely with them as well, giving them their +1 to wound. They definitely seem like a solid enough selection for White Scar lists. I think they're generally strong enough for any chapter though, just on their raw stats alone. Dark Angels will get them permanent transhuman with the Deathwing options. Blood Angels, Space Wolves and Black Templars will all have their decent options being melee related chapters, and are maybe quite well paired with something like a character with the Rights of War to give them obsec, which is really nice to have on tough infantry like these. They're perhaps one of the units that makes the best use of the Space Marine Impulsor as well. They can make good use of the extra mobility that it brings, and also on a per model basis, they're dangerous and tough enough to be worth it to fork out for the transport in some armies. In game, I'd typically be looking to take them in 3 to 5 model units, and use them as slightly expendable but very tough melee threats to advance onto the midfield objectives and fight off any enemies that try and take them instead of them. They can be quite good for running alongside infantry characters as they move at a similar speed. I think it's kind of hard to go too far wrong with a small unit or two of these in Space Marine lists, even if all they're doing is being tough and having an extra countercharge threat. Next up, I thought we'd move on to the Redemptor Dreadnought, which despite having really quite a decent combat weapon, is arguably one of the best gun platforms in all of Codex Space Marines. The Macroplasma Incinerator is really quite nice at cracking tanks, and then it can back that up with an Onslaught Gatling Cannon, Icarus Pod and Storm Bolters, and it just means it's really quite a nice generalist gun platform, threatening against most things, and most importantly has the core keyword, so captains and lieutenants and things can give them rerolls. They're also tough enough as well, with 13 wounds and the -1 damage baked in for a Duty Eternal. And of course they do pack a fairly hefty melee punch as well, maybe not so great against hordes, but a damage D3 plus 3 melee attack makes them incredibly dangerous to things like characters, vehicles and monsters. On top of that, Wisdom of the Ancients is really quite a nice stratagem to have around. 1 command point for a pop-up bobble of rerolls can often be worth it if you've got enough things to buff. In terms of weaknesses, as vehicles, they'll typically get taken down in short order to high strength AP and high damage weapons. Any chapters that can get them a 5+ invul or better are really quite nice choices due to that. Things like Admech Cognis Las Cannons or Drakari Dark Lances will make short work of them, Duty Eternal or not. They also could have the potential to get swarmed for a turn or two. They don't really have all that many attacks in close combat, and if you're not taking the Gatling Cannon they won't have all that many shots in combat either, though typically they should do enough damage to at least chip away decently at anything that tags them. For their war gear, as I mentioned before, I would take the Macroplasma Incinerator at the moment. It's a really solid anti-tank and anti-elite weapon, and the blast rule helps it out against big hordes too. I would take the Onslaught Gatling Cannon over the Heavy Flamer. The 8 shots that it kicks out are really good value for the points. I think the Storm Bolters and the Fragstorm launchers are kind of balanced. I would have the Storm Bolters over the Fragstorms myself. I personally prefer the extra range and the extra threat at close range rather than the sort of midfield of both. Finally, I think for the extra 5 points the Icarus launcher is really good as well. Basically very similar to an autocannon's worth of extra damage for only 5 points. Again, is excellent for the points. I'd only leave that off if points are incredibly tight. Generally these dreadnoughts are often found in dreadnought castle type lists, perhaps a few redemptors alongside certain characters, often things like captains, lieutenants or tech marines, to give them better rerolls, 1 dreadnought plus 1 to hit, and repair any damage that they might take. Chapter wise, certainly anything that can get them a 5+ invul is great, as I mentioned. Deathwatch have that one via the Dominus Aegis relic, and they perhaps make some of the best dreadnought castles in the game with their various other options for very good rerolls. Black Templars have their Vow for a 5+ invul save across their whole army, but again, like the Bladeguard, they're just generally all round strong. Basically any chapter can make good use of them. In game, I think most of the time it's just going to make sense to use them as more of a gun platform as opposed to being a melee threat, hiding out of line of sight turn 1 and then moving around to get line of sight on what they need to. Perhaps not the worst choice for tagging onto home field objectives and keeping them held, though of course if they can get opportunistic charges off against heavies or characters, then they still have the potential for loads of melee damage too. Overall, all round strong, and perhaps not the best for internal balance within the Space Marine Codex. They make quite a lot of the other gun platform choices just not really all that great by comparison. Particularly virtually any tank that the Space Marines can field just feels like less efficient shooting than Redemptor Dreadnoughts, who have similar firepower, massive melee, and also get rerolls due to being core. Next up, I thought we'd mention two different utility units, Servitors and Company Veterans. These ones incredibly competitive, not because of their damage dealing, but because they can be absolutely vital to winning games in 9th. Starting with the Servitors, you get 30 points for a mini unit of 4 of them, and are kind of nice to have within the Space Marine Codex, as they're basically the easiest way to get a unit of cheap chaff to do all the expendable things that aren't really worthy of Space Marines proper. Grunt work like taking objectives, screening, actions, and being expendable. If the enemy doesn't have any ignores line of sight weapons or ways to reach your home field objective, if you can plonk a unit of Servitors out of line of sight on it, then you might just have secured your home field for about the cheapest amount of points that you can. If the enemy's got lots of reserves coming, then you could put these on the flanks of your army to force out another 9-inch bubble and make sure that your opponent can't drop reserves in a place where they can actually damage the core of your army. If there's any unit that's best to put on the front lines and take the brunt of enemy aggression before you strike back, it may as well be some incredibly cheap Servitors. And having a very low power level, it's really cheap to put Servitors into strategic reserve. It means that small units of these can pop up around the board to help you achieve secondaries. Things like doing actions such as retrieve Octarius data, get in table quarters for engage on all fronts, or commit them to raising banners and things rather than wasting Space Marines doing those things. In general, even though I wouldn't expect them to do really anything in terms of damage or even being particularly durable for the cost, they can have a lot of great value by freeing up the rest of your army to actually focus on doing the fighting. In a very similar vein, Company Veterans have a lot of the same benefits. They can be taken in incredibly small Space Marine squads of just 2 men, and they're 40 points base if you don't give them any gear. Again, that makes them a very solid choice for things like screening, doing actions, or holding objectives for super cheap. But in addition to that, they also have the benefit of allowing really good character protection. They have that bodyguard rule that means that you can't target characters with ranged weapons when they're within 3 inches of Company Veterans, even if you happen to have snipers along. It seems to be quite a common trick in Space Marine lists to put these out of line of sight, put your characters in line of sight, but keep them within 3 inches of the Company Veterans, and that just gives the characters a bit more freedom of positioning without having to worry about being shot to death. Those shenanigans get to an entire other level when the characters that you're protecting are really significant. Things like that Iron Hands Dreadnought that they can make into a character for a gun turret that you can't really do anything about, similar for Ravenwing Talon Masters, or just other incredibly high value characters, things maybe like Marnius Calgar or Rabute Gilliman. Overall, not a bad little utility unit, and quite a popular one in competitive Marine lists. Next up we have another melee powerhouse of the Codex, and we're talking about the mighty Vanguard Veterans. These guys are one of the most common competitive Space Marine units out of any of them. They just seem to be the right combination of being very fast with their jump packs, pretty tough with their storm shields, and having a nice flexibility of power weapons that they can choose from that are really quite cheap, that allow you to tool them up for the task of exactly how much damage dealing you want to do. Even despite a minor points cost increase to the jump packs and the storm shields, they still seem to be seeing a lot of play. There's definitely a lot to like about Vanvets. I'd say they're perhaps the go-to Space Marine combat damage dealer right now. A really good balance of strong, fast and tough. Weaknesses wise, maybe not having transhuman physiology is a bit of a niggle. On Vanvets that could definitely do a lot of work with them being only toughness 4 and often being targeted by high strength weapons. Currently I'd say the default good loadout for them is a bit of an unusual one model wise. A single lightning claw, a storm shield and a jump pack on each one seems like it's going to be the best way to go. Storm shields certainly add enough durability to be worth the points, the jump packs get them where they need to be, and the lightning claws are really good general purpose melee weapons, and it's quite nice to be able to throw so many attacks that damage 1 at the enemy, all with re-rolling wound rolls, so you're pretty much guaranteed to stack a bunch of wounds on whatever you hit. Generally taking the storm shield is by far preferable to having the second lightning claw or a bolt pistol or something, as it makes them far better at sticking around for the cost. Otherwise, some people like to use relic blades on the sergeants, or potentially thunder hammers to put some hefty hurt on heavy hitters. and keeping one or two cheap with chainswords is pretty reasonable as well. Could be a reasonable option for tanking damage or dying first to mortal wounds. In general though, Jump Pack, Storm Shield and Lightning Claw really isn't a bad fallback if you're unsure. Basically any assault chapter will get more value out of them. White Scars in particular really like them as well, getting 2 damage on those Lightning Claws and having a massive threat range with their already good movement. They're also very commonly played in lists like Space Wolves and Blood Angels. Space Wolves in particular, as they can take their Wolfguard variant of the unit, and that arbitrarily just costs a couple of points less because Games Workshop didn't adjust them. They're a good choice to be running alongside with fast moving characters, things like Jump Pack Captains or Librarians, or the Primaris Chaplain on the bike. In game, they're generally going to be the units that you want to use to take the fight to the enemy, jumping from cover to cover up the board, using those Storm Shields to tank incoming damage, and hopefully getting stuck into something important in the enemy army, particularly being really good at blending infantry. Finally, last but by no means least, we have the Relic Contemptor Dreadnought, particularly the one armed with the Volkite Culverins. Alongside the Redemptor, this is basically one of the strongest picks for Space Marine gun platforms right now, and it really has quite a lot of the same benefits. It's pretty tough with 9 wounds and a 5+ invul, has the core keyword for rerolls, and its firepower is nicely generalist, with those Volkite Culverins putting out some great anti-infantry damage, and just stacking so many saves on heavier targets that usually a couple of them will sneak through, chased down by a few mortal wounds. The range is great as well, all the way out to 45 inches, so can outrange several other options, and again they can use Wisdom of the Ancients to get some rerolls if they need more damage. They do have that Martial Legacy rule, which means that if you strap for CP, these will cost you 1 more each, which can be a little bit restrictive in game, and they might well underwhelm you against really high save targets, though again having a few mortal wounds punched through might well make up for that. I'd consider the default loadout just to be the standard Dreadnought with the 2 Culverins, that's 150 points right now, that you could potentially upgrade to the Cyclone missile launchers on the top. An extra 25 points on a couple of powerful missiles really isn't bad if you're thinking about buffing them anyway, though obviously you're not really gaining any more durability for those points invested. Again, they'll be right at home alongside Tech Marines and reroll characters in mini Dreadnought castles, and perhaps some of the best chapters are any that can easily manipulate doctrines. Those Volkites don't have any AP at base, so if you can get them the extra AP -1 just for being in Devastator Doctrine, then that's absolutely excellent. Deathwatch have a couple of different ways to do this, and also have some great rerolls potential with things like the Tome of Ectoclades. And the Iron Hands can make great use of this guy by making him a character for 1 CP, making him untargetable, and being able to blaze away with those Volkites and maybe some missiles all game long when the enemy can't shoot back. Basically though, I think adding one of these to any chapter isn't really the worst idea. He's efficient enough to stand on his own 2 feet without buffs, and can be a good choice to add a bit of fire support to a more assault themed chapter. In game, kind of similarly to the Redemptor Dreadnought, is likely to be lurking around the deployment zone, maybe helping secure home field objectives, but largely just wanting to get line of sight on enemy units, delete them, and hopefully stay fairly safe from being tagged in combat, just to keep its target priority options open. Overall, monstrously strong firepower with good reroll access. I wouldn't be at all surprised to see these guys toned down whenever Games Workshop next does their big points cost adjustment. So anyway, hope you've enjoyed a bit of a discussion of some of the top units for the Codex Space Marines Elites choices. Do you agree or disagree with my selections? Is there anything else that I should have mentioned maybe? I look forward to hearing any of your insights playing with or against these units down in the comments. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, or I'll certainly keep the 40k related content coming, including plenty more for the Space Marines. Finally, if you have been enjoying the channel so far, I would just quite like to mention one way in which you can help support Auspex Tactics, and that's my Element Games affiliate link, which you can find down in the video description below. Element Games is a UK-based discount retailer. They usually give 10 to 20% off Games Workshop's miniatures and other hobby supplies, and if you click and order anything through them, a small amount goes to help support Auspex Tactics without costing you any more whatsoever. If you are thinking about buying something anyway, then that's one way that you can help support the channel if you'd like to. Otherwise, for people in the USA and Canada, there is also an Amazon affiliate link down there as well. That one works very similarly. Just click the link, buy literally anything off Amazon, and a small amount goes to help support Auspex Tactics without costing you any more. A massive thank you to you guys who have been using those, it really does help out. And in any case, a big thank you for watching. I'll hope to see you guys next time.